For nearly 50 years, the file sat untouched on a shelf inside the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. Its pages had faded. The photographs had yellowed. The fingerprints had long since been cataloged. And the victim's family had slowly accepted the possibility that they would never know who had taken John Curtis Patterson's life. Time had buried the evidence beneath decades of unanswered questions. Witnesses had grown old. Investigators had retired. Some had passed away. The crime scene no longer existed as it had on that cold Colorado day in 1975. To most people, the case was forgotten. But to a small team of detectives assigned to the cold case unit, it was unfinished business. They believed the killer had made one mistake. One tiny mistake. A mistake that technology in 1975 could never detect. As modern forensic science continued evolving, investigators across America began reopening murder files that had once been considered impossible to solve. Some were solved through DNA, others through fingerprints, others through evidence that had sat untouched inside sealed evidence rooms for decades. Then came the Patterson file. Investigators removed dusty evidence boxes that had not been opened for years. Every document was reviewed. Every photograph was scanned again. Every ballistic report was re-examined using technology that simply did not exist when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. The detectives weren't chasing a new suspect. They were chasing history itself. Because somewhere inside thousands of pages was a clue that everyone had overlooked. A clue waiting almost 50 years to reveal the truth. When the investigation finally reached its conclusion in 2025, veteran detectives described it as one of the most satisfying resolutions of a cold case in recent Colorado history. The question that had haunted investigators for half a century was finally answered. Not because someone confessed, not because a witness suddenly remembered, but because science eventually caught up with the killer. And what investigators uncovered would finally give John Curtis Patterson's family something they had almost stopped believing was possible: justice. In the fall of 1975, John Curtis Patterson was only 20 years old, but friends and family already described him as dependable, hardworking, and determined to build a better future. He had taken a job as a clerk at the Cascade service station on the 4500 block of North Broadway in Boulder County, Colorado, a quiet gas station that served commuters, truck drivers, and local residents throughout the day and into the night. It was the kind of place where regular customers recognized familiar faces, and where a routine evening shift rarely brought anything more exciting than filling gas tanks or selling snacks. On September 29, 1975, Patterson reported for work like any other day. There was nothing unusual about the beginning of his shift. He greeted customers, handled cash transactions, and carried out the responsibilities that came with working alone during parts of the evening. To everyone around him, it appeared to be another ordinary night. Then, sometime during his shift, something changed. When concern grew after Patterson could no longer be located inside the station, deputies responded to the business. Inside a restroom, they discovered the young clerk dead from a single fatal stab wound to the chest. Nearby, investigators found 2 unfired .30 caliber cartridges on the bathroom floor. The gas station's cash register had been left open, and money was missing, leading detectives to believe that robbery had been the motive behind the attack. The crime scene immediately presented investigators with an unusual combination of evidence. The unfired cartridges showed marks indicating they had been cycled through a firearm but had failed to discharge. Detectives carefully collected the cartridges, photographed the scene, secured physical evidence, and began interviewing anyone who might have seen suspicious activity near the station that evening. In the hours that followed, Boulder County investigators launched an intensive homicide investigation. They knew the killer had likely left the station only minutes before deputies arrived. Somewhere beyond the flashing patrol lights, someone was carrying the answers to John Patterson's final moments. What detectives didn't yet realize was that this investigation would follow them, not for weeks or months, but for nearly half a century. The murder of John Curtis Patterson sent shockwaves through Boulder County, but despite an aggressive investigation, detectives quickly discovered that solving the case would be far more difficult than they had imagined. In the days following the homicide, investigators interviewed dozens of potential witnesses. Employees from nearby businesses, customers who had visited the gas station that evening, local residents, and motorists traveling along North Broadway were all asked the same question. Did you see anything unusual? Some remembered seeing unfamiliar vehicles. Others believed they had noticed suspicious individuals in the area. But none of those observations could identify the killer with certainty. Detectives processed every inch of the crime scene. They collected fingerprints, photographed blood evidence, documented the open cash register, and carefully preserved the 2 unfired .30 caliber cartridges recovered from the restroom floor. Because nearly 50 years later, a new generation of investigators would reopen the dusty evidence boxes with tools the original detectives could never have imagined. And hidden inside one small piece of metal was a clue that had been waiting half a century to finally reveal the killer's identity. For decades, the murder of John Curtis Patterson remained exactly where investigators feared it would stay, inside a cardboard evidence box labeled as an unsolved homicide. But by the early 2020s, law enforcement agencies across the United States were achieving something once thought impossible. Cold cases that had defeated detectives for generations were suddenly being solved, not because new witnesses came forward, but because technology had transformed the way investigators examined old evidence. The Boulder County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit decided it was time to take another look at Patterson's file. This wasn't simply a review of old reports. Investigators started from the beginning. They reread every witness statement. They digitized photographs taken in 1975. They compared investigative notes, timelines, and evidence logs that had been written nearly half a century earlier. Most importantly, they re-examined the physical evidence that had been carefully preserved since the night of the murder. Among the items were the 2 unfired .30 caliber cartridges recovered from the crime scene. Back in 1975, detectives believed the cartridges were important, but there was little forensic science could do with them beyond documenting their physical characteristics. In 2025, that changed. Advances in firearm identification technology allowed forensic experts to analyze microscopic tool marks left on ammunition as it passes through a firearm. These marks, created by internal parts of the weapon, can sometimes act like a fingerprint, linking ammunition to a specific gun or to other crime scenes. Investigators submitted the cartridges for renewed examination using modern techniques unavailable to the original investigators. The results immediately caught the attention of detectives. The microscopic markings suggested a connection that investigators in 1975 could never have established. Suddenly, the Patterson investigation was no longer standing alone. Evidence indicated that the same firearm, or at least the same distinctive mechanical markings, had appeared elsewhere, giving detectives an entirely new direction to investigate. Instead of searching blindly through decades of tips, they now had a tangible forensic lead that could be followed using modern databases and historical records. Nearly 50 years after John Patterson lost his life, science had accomplished what thousands of investigative hours could not. For the first time since 1975, detectives believed they were no longer chasing a mystery. They were closing in on a name. When the newly analyzed ballistic evidence was compared against historical records, investigators finally saw what generations of detectives had been hoping for. The microscopic markings on the unfired .30 caliber cartridges recovered from the crime scene pointed toward the same firearm involved in another homicide investigated years earlier. That connection gave detectives something they had never possessed before: a direct forensic bridge between John Patterson's murder and another violent crime. With that breakthrough, the Boulder County Cold Case Unit began reconstructing events that had occurred nearly 5 decades earlier. Detectives pulled archived police reports, compared witness statements from separate investigations, and reviewed evidence that had been stored in different jurisdictions. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to fit together. The investigation ultimately identified James Edward Mankins as the man responsible for Patterson's murder. Mankins had already been identified as the perpetrator in another homicide years after Patterson's death, but in 1975 investigators had no scientific method capable of linking him to the Boulder County crime. It was only through modern forensic firearm analysis that authorities were finally able to establish the connection. For detectives, the revelation was both satisfying and bittersweet. The mystery had finally been solved, But justice would never look the way investigators had once imagined. James Edward Mankins had died decades earlier. For John Patterson's loved ones, the announcement could never erase the pain of losing him. But after half a century of uncertainty, they finally received the answer they had spent decades waiting to hear. When the Boulder County Sheriff's Office announced that John Curtis Patterson's murder had finally been solved, the news reached far beyond Colorado. It wasn't simply another cold case closed. It became a powerful example of why investigators across the United States continue to preserve evidence, even when decades pass without an arrest. To many people, a 50-year-old homicide appears impossible to solve. Memories fade. Witnesses die. Crime scenes disappear beneath new buildings and changing landscapes. But detectives understand something the public often doesn't. Physical evidence never forgets. The cartridges recovered from the Cascade service station in 1975 had remained inside an evidence locker for nearly half a century. While technology at the time could only document their appearance, modern forensic science was able to examine microscopic tool marks invisible to earlier investigators. Those tiny imperfections, created as ammunition moved through the internal components of a firearm, became the key that unlocked one of Boulder County's oldest unsolved murders. Investigators explained that the success of the case was not the result of luck. It was the product of careful evidence preservation, meticulous record-keeping, and decades of advancements in forensic science. Had the original detectives failed to preserve those cartridges, the opportunity to identify the killer might have been lost forever. The Patterson investigation also highlighted the growing role of specialized cold case units. Unlike active homicide squads responding to new crimes every day, these investigators devote months, or even years, to reviewing forgotten files. They revisit witness statements, compare evidence using modern databases, and apply scientific methods that simply did not exist when the crimes were first committed. For younger detectives working the case in 2025, solving Patterson's murder was deeply personal. Although none of them had been employed when the homicide occurred, they considered it their responsibility to finish the work started by investigators nearly 50 years earlier. Their success carried an important message to families still waiting for answers in unsolved cases across America. A cold case is not necessarily a forgotten case. Sometimes, justice isn't delayed because investigators stop searching. Sometimes, justice simply has to wait for science to catch up. For the family of John Curtis Patterson, the announcement in 2025 marked the end of a journey that had lasted almost 50 years. When John was murdered on September 29, 1975, those closest to him expected answers to come within days or weeks. Instead, the investigation slowly faded from newspaper headlines, and year after year, birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings passed without anyone knowing who had taken his life. Every unsolved murder leaves behind more than a police file. It leaves behind unanswered conversations. It leaves behind empty chairs at family dinners. It leaves behind parents, siblings, relatives, and friends who spend decades wondering whether justice will ever arrive. As the years passed, generations of investigators came and went, but John Patterson's family never completely lost hope. Although they understood that the chances of solving such an old case became smaller with every passing year, they also knew the sheriff's office had never officially closed the investigation. That decision proved to be one of the most important choices investigators ever made. When the Boulder County Sheriff's Office announced that modern forensic firearm analysis had finally identified James Edward Mankins as the person responsible, the family at last received something they had been denied for nearly half a century: the truth. Although Mankins had already died and could never stand trial, investigators emphasized that solving the case still mattered. Identifying the offender officially corrected the historical record, closed one of the county's oldest unsolved homicide investigations, and gave the victim's family a documented answer supported by forensic evidence rather than speculation. During the public announcement, detectives acknowledged the work of both the original investigators from 1975 and the modern cold case unit. Without the careful preservation of evidence decades earlier, the breakthrough in 2025 would never have been possible. For the Patterson family, justice did not arrive in the form of a courtroom verdict. It arrived in the form of certainty, After nearly 50 years of unanswered questions, they finally knew who had taken John's life and why the investigation had never stopped searching. Sometimes the greatest gift investigators can give a family isn't an arrest. It's the truth that history can no longer hide. Today, the old Cascade service station is no longer remembered simply as a neighborhood gas station. For investigators, it represents one of the clearest examples of how a single piece of preserved evidence can outlive an entire generation of detectives. When John Curtis Patterson was murdered in 1975, no one could have imagined that the cartridges collected from the crime scene would still be helping investigators nearly 50 years later. At the time, forensic experts documented them carefully, knowing they might become important someday, but they had no way of predicting just how valuable they would become. That decision changed everything. As technology advanced, evidence that once appeared ordinary became extraordinary. The microscopic markings left on the unfired cartridges ultimately provided investigators with the connection they had searched for since the very first night of the investigation. It was a reminder that in criminal investigations, even the smallest object can hold the answer to the biggest question. The Patterson case has since become an example frequently discussed among homicide investigators and cold case specialists. It demonstrates why evidence preservation, detailed documentation, and patience remain some of the most powerful tools in modern law enforcement. Detectives who never met John Patterson were still able to complete the work started by officers decades before they joined the profession. For the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, closing the case was about more than statistics. Every solved homicide represents a promise fulfilled, a promise that victims are not forgotten simply because time has passed. The investigation also carried a broader message for families across the United States who are still waiting for answers in unsolved cases. Thousands of cold case files remain open, but advances in forensic science continue to create opportunities that did not exist years ago. Every preserved fingerprint, every DNA sample, every bullet casing, and every piece of evidence has the potential to reveal the truth when technology catches up. John Curtis Patterson's story proves that justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years, and sometimes it takes half a century before a victim finally receives the answer that should have come long ago. Many people believe justice only exists when a suspect is arrested, stands before a judge, and hears a guilty verdict delivered in court. But the Patterson investigation reminds us that justice can take different forms. Because James Edward Mankins had died years before investigators solved the case, there would never be a trial. No jury would hear the evidence. No sentence would ever be imposed. Yet detectives still considered the investigation a success because they had accomplished the one objective that had remained out of reach for nearly 50 years: identifying the person responsible through reliable forensic evidence. For investigators, solving a cold case is about restoring history. An unsolved murder leaves a permanent question mark, not only for the victim's family but also for the community. When that question is finally answered, the official record reflects the truth instead of uncertainty. The Patterson investigation also honored the determination of the original detectives who worked tirelessly in 1975. Although they lacked today's forensic technology, they understood the importance of preserving every piece of evidence. Their careful work allowed future investigators to succeed where earlier generations simply lacked the scientific tools. As news of the breakthrough spread, many law enforcement agencies pointed to the case as proof that cold case units are worth the investment. Across America, thousands of families continue waiting for answers, and each solved investigation renews hope that other forgotten files may one day reach the same conclusion. John Patterson never had the opportunity to grow older, build the future he had planned, or see the remarkable advances in science that would eventually identify his killer. But through the dedication of investigators separated by 50 years, his voice was finally heard again. And after nearly half a century of silence, his case was no longer a mystery. Nearly 50 years separated the crime from its solution. In that time, America changed. Cities grew, technology advanced, and entire generations came and went. Yet inside an evidence room in Boulder County, a small collection of carefully preserved exhibits quietly waited for the day when science would finally reveal what human investigators could not. The story of John Curtis Patterson is not simply the story of a murder. It is the story of perseverance, of investigators who refused to let a victim be forgotten, of forensic scientists who transformed microscopic evidence into undeniable answers, and of a family that spent decades living with uncertainty before finally receiving the truth. Although the man identified as Patterson's killer could never face a courtroom, the investigation achieved something equally important. It restored John's name to history not as the victim of an unsolved mystery, but as a victim whose case was ultimately solved through evidence.